Okay, so just a couple of new things to talk about. I know you all saw that the CDC updated its guidance for vaccinated individuals, that masks are not necessary outside unless you are in a crowd. I haven't put that in the slide deck, mostly because it's not going to really affect you from a business point of view. Really, the business guidelines have not changed much. We're still wearing masks at work unless we're sitting alone in an office. So keep that in mind. But a couple of other things going on, sort of piggybacking off of the union information that we talked about last week. On April 26th, President Biden signed an executive order creating a White House task force on worker organizing and empowerment. The task force is going to be chaired by Vice President Kamala Harris. The vice chair will be the new Department of Labor head, Marty Walsh, and then there will be 20 cabinet members and federal agency heads serving on the task force. And the idea behind the task force is to mobilizing the federal government's policies, programs, and practices to empower workers to organize and successfully bargain with their employers. Something that most employers don't want to hear, right? But really, it's about trying to make the federal government a model employer from a union's point of view. So these are going to be guidelines that are going to come out to guide how the federal government deals with its unions. And this is certainly, I imagine, is going to bleed into the private sector. So kind of stay tuned on that, something to keep watch of. And then another thing that came out in the last week is that the Department of Labor announced an Essential Workers, Essential Protections Initiative. The goal is to try to educate employees so that they know about their wage and hour rights. And there also are some FAQs that came down that are actually kind of helpful for employers with regard to answer some questions that I think we already kind of knew the answers to, but to more definitively answer some questions. So I know last year when we started implementing temperature checks, the various states said you got to check temperatures. Does that time need to be paid? So the Department of Labor is saying the time should be paid if undergoing a temperature check before work is necessary for the job. And it gives an example of a nurse working in the hospital. And certainly after the workday begins, that time should certainly be paid. What I would say, if you're requiring temperature checks as an employer, let's pay employees for that. Let's make sure that to the extent they're hourly employees, they're clocked in for that time. Same thing around COVID testing. If the employer requires COVID testing during normal work hours, the employer must pay the employee for that time spent both waiting for and receiving the medical attention, whether it's on their premises or at their direction. So if the employer sends an employee to an off-site to get tested, that's time paid. And if COVID testing is done on days before the employee can return to work, if it's a requirement of the job, again, the employer needs to pay for that time. So something to think about. And I've talked individually with lots of members about whether or not employers should be requiring COVID testing to return to work. There are other options, certainly around quarantine and around isolation. Employers do not need to require a test to come back to work. Keep in mind that the testing can be expensive if the employer is not going to cover it, not always covered by insurance, especially for asymptomatic situations or exposure situations. So you don't need to be requiring testing for employees to come back to work. There are other options, but if you're going to require it, it looks like according to the DOL, you're going to have to pay, you should be paying for that time. And then DOL also weighed in on teleworking. Employers may encourage or require employees to telework, both as an infection control strategy, that's what a lot of us have been doing for the last year, and can also use telework as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, something to think about, the sort of the after effects of the pandemic, things that will linger with us for a long time, is a lot of employers would have told you, 14, 15 months ago that telework doesn't work for our workforce. We can't do that here. And I think the pandemic has shown many of those employers to be wrong about that. And so I think it's going to be harder to say in the future that we can't use telework as a reasonable accommodation for many positions. So something to keep an eye on. But also remember that you can't single out certain employees to telework or reporting to the workplace based on discrimination or retaliation issues. So you can't pick out the older employees and say, no, we don't want you to come back into the office, for example. It's got to be based on something. It's got to be based on a medical need, a reasonable accommodation situation. There's got to be always a good, valid business reason for the decisions that you make, especially if you're treating one set of employees differently than others. And then also around teleworking, we've gotten a lot of questions around this. What about the equipment that employees are using at home? Well, the best idea obviously was for employers to send their employees home with their laptops, in many cases with monitors, maybe some folks with printers. But if employees are required to pay for items, the employer can't, the cost of those items can't drive the employee down below minimum wage. So keep that in mind. There also are some state laws around this, not in Pennsylvania, but in some states like California, I believe Illinois as well. Employers do need to pay employees for the cost of what they're using at home, including the cost of the internet or their cell phone if they're using those for business purposes. And then also OSHA did issue a directive way back in February of, I should say 2020, stating that it will not inspect employees' home offices, won't hold employers liable for the employees' home offices, does not expect employers to inspect their home offices. Employers that are required to keep records of work-related injuries and illnesses will continue to be responsible for that. So keep in mind, but you're not responsible as an employer to go ahead and inspect your employee's home office to make sure that it's safe. That's a conversation I would also have with your workers' comp carrier, see what they think, see what they want you to do, make sure you're in compliance with them so that anything that needs to be covered will be covered. And then we talked about this last week as well, but I just want to point out EEOC finally released its 2020 statistics, or fiscal year 2020 statistics. So keep in mind that their fiscal year runs from, it starts at the beginning of the fourth quarter. So these statistics run from October 1st of 2019 through September 30th of 2020. So they don't pick up quite as much of the pandemic. Only part of the time is pandemic related time. So I think that might skew the statistics a little bit, because what we traditionally find is that charges go up during a bad economy, charges come down during a good economy. So the charges were still relatively down. There was a downward trend that has been happening since the Great Recession, with the exception, I think, of 2016. There was a little bit of a spike. For the most part, overall charges are down, but the commission is still working hard for those who they deem victims of discrimination, $439 million last year. And then this is the percentage. I didn't put in some of the lesser percentages, but these are the biggest bulk of the cases that the EEOC sees. Retaliation, always a big chunk. More than half of the cases filed have a retaliation component. And then I don't think a surprise, disability, race, sex, and age are the next big chunks. So something to keep in mind. You know, we hear a lot from employers that, well, our employees aren't even in the office, so is this really something we need to be worrying about? Well, yeah, take a look at your anti-harassment, your discrimination policies, review your complaint procedures, especially while you're virtual. How do your employees get to you? How do they raise a complaint or a concern? Make sure all your managers and employees are trained. Your managers know how to deal with a complaint should it come through. Your employees know what their own rights and responsibilities are. If you haven't done anti-harassment training in 2 or more years, great time to go ahead and do that now. And then just a reminder, or I think we talked about this last week as well, we do have a guide, Returning to the Workplace. This includes a lot of good information. I know a lot of the members that I'm talking to, if you haven't been in person for a while, or maybe your white collar folks have not been in person for a while, they're thinking about coming back to the office. So this just talks about some of the big issues that you might be facing, thinking about your timelines, think about your vaccinations, how you're going to handle all of these issues as they arise. And then finally, we did want everybody to submit suggestions for future town halls. So please feel free to do that now in the Q&A or in the chat, or you can email us later and we're happy to take a look at that. We're taking ideas. But in the meantime, let's see if we have any questions, Kevin.
Just two related to temperatures. Someone asked if someone's only has a self-monitoring process, so you fill out your own form, take your own temperature. Is that time spent on that to be paid?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully what I'm thinking about when I think about time spent checking temperatures is the line that people have to wait in usually at work. So yeah, if they're taking their temperature at home, that hopefully takes what the Department of Labor would call a de minimis amount of time and probably would not need to get paid. If you have some long, lengthy checklist that they have to go through, that might be different if it took them 5 or 10 minutes to do that every day. But yeah, if this is taking 30 seconds to do, I think you're probably okay.
And then someone asked whether you've heard anything in terms of the releasing of the requirements of the daily temperature now that we're getting close to the vaccine and health screenings. Nothing's come
Yeah,
out.
I haven't heard anything yet. I remain hopeful that in 30, 60, maybe 90 days, CDC is going to really loosen up for those who've been vaccinated. And what we've seen generally is that New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and really all the states in the Northeast, tend to follow what the CDC says. So stay tuned, hopefully.
Yep. Someone made an observation. One thing to consider is someone opts to continue working remotely, making sure that your process about promotions and rewards and recognition, that it's the whole hybrid world. How do we kind of do this when we're not all together? And I think that's a whole bigger discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we're really going to need to think about going forward from an employee relations point of view, is that I think a lot of employers have decided this hybrid works, or this entirely work from home works. I've talked to a number of members who've said, we're not going to limit our search for new employees to our geographic region. We're going to look for the best employees anywhere in the country and maybe beyond. And so yeah, you're going to need to think about how that works with your processes and make sure that the folks who are working at home are being treated fairly as much as the folks who are getting that face time in the office.
And we did have one question came in. So the question about the mandatory temperature check, that is a CDC in a state, but it can be a self-check. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Pennsylvania has said that can be a self-check. But yes, employers
So
are still supposed to be taking temperatures every day.
But you can have the employees certify that they don't have a temperature.
Exactly, and so a lot of employers use an app or an email that employees respond to. But yes, it's still a requirement in Pennsylvania.
Great. Well, we always think we're going to have a short meeting, and then there's so much stuff going on that we end up going a little bit over. We apologize for that, but all great stuff. Thank you, Mike and Amy, for keeping us informed, and we hope we see all of you next week as well. Take care.
Everybody have a great week.